In the cold, brittle pages of Appalachian history, nestled between records of hardship and faith, there are stories that defy easy explanation. These are the accounts that are spoken of in hushed tones, away from the hearth, stories of events that left a permanent scar on the soul of a place. The official history of Harlan, a small, isolated town carved into the mountains, speaks of a harsh winter in 1879, but the unofficial history, the one preserved in frightened whispers and faded letters, tells of the arrival of a child. She was a mute girl whose silence was not empty, but filled with the darkest thoughts of those who met her gaze, a silence that could echo in your mind with the sound of your own damnation. If the quiet archives of the unsettling and the unexplained are where you seek refuge, and you are new to this cabinet of curiosities, then consider subscribing. Become a keeper of the records that time has tried to forget. The winter of 1879 descended upon the ridges of Appalachia not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a predatory force. It was a season of profound, biting cold that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the land, freezing the sap in ancient trees and silencing the calls of birds. The wind that swept down the hollows was a mournful, ceaseless thing, a voice that spoke of isolation and an ancient, unforgiving wilderness. It was in this stark and challenging world that the town of Harlan existed, a small constellation of rough-hewn cabins and a single muddy track that served as its main street. The people of Harlan were as rugged and weathered as the landscape they inhabited. They were bound by a shared faith, a common struggle against the elements, and a deep-seated suspicion of the world that lay beyond their mountain enclave. Their lives were governed by the rising and setting of the sun, the success or failure of their meager crops, and the simple, stark tenets of their scripture. It was a world of certainty, of hard work and quiet endurance, where the mysterious and the unexplained were often interpreted as omens, dark portents from a watchful and judgmental God. Into this crucible of hardship and faith, a new element was introduced. The news arrived via a circuit rider, a man whose face was chapped raw by the wind, that an orphan was being sent to them from a county further east. She was a child left behind by a cholera outbreak that had swept through a distant settlement, leaving no other family to claim her. A couple in Harlan, unable to have children of their own, had agreed to take her in. The man, whom we shall refer to as the father, was a blacksmith by trade, a man of few words, whose hands were thick with callus, and whose temperament was as steady and solid as the iron he worked. His wife, the mother, was a woman whose quiet demeanor concealed a deep and unfulfilled well of maternal longing. She had spent years praying for a child to fill the silence of their small, two-room cabin, a silence broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the distant howl of the winter wind. The prospect of this orphan's arrival was, for her, the answer to a desperate prayer, a chance to nurture a life in a place so often defined by its struggle against death. She prepared for the child's arrival with a meticulous and hopeful energy, mending old linens, setting aside a small portion of their winter stores, and carving a small wooden bird, a simple toy for a child she had never met. The humanizing detail of this simple, hopeful act stands in stark contrast to the horror that was to follow. The girl arrived on a day when the sky was the color of slate, heavy and low, with the promise of more snow. She was brought in a small cart by a county official, a man whose weary expression made it clear he considered this journey a grim duty. The child was small for her estimated age of 7 years, a frail figure bundled in a threadbare coat that was several sizes too large. Her name, the official stated, was Eliza Whitcomb. And then he added the crucial detail: the girl did not speak. He reported that she had not uttered a single sound since she had been found wandering the empty lanes of her former home. He offered no medical explanation, for there was none to offer. He simply presented her as a fact, a silent piece of human cargo to be delivered and signed for. The father signed the ledger with a steady hand, and the official, with a palpable sense of relief, turned his cart around and departed, leaving the small figure standing in the snow before the cabin. The mother knelt down, her face arranged in a warm, welcoming smile. She spoke to the child in soft, gentle tones, telling her that she was safe now, that this was her home. She asked the girl her name, already knowing the answer but hoping to coax some sound, any sound, from her. Eliza Whitcomb did not respond. She did not nod, or flinch, or even seem to register the woman's voice. Her silence was absolute. It was not the shy reticence of a frightened child, but a profound and unnerving void of sound, a perfect, unbroken stillness that seemed to absorb the mother's gentle words and give nothing back. And then there were her eyes. They were a pale, washed-out shade of gray, the color of the winter sky, and they were fixed upon the mother with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. It was not a vacant stare, nor was it an aggressive one. It was a gaze of immense, preternatural focus, as if she were not merely looking at the woman before her, but looking into her, through her, accessing some deep, interior space that was meant to be private. The mother felt a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the freezing air. For a fleeting moment, a thought, ugly and unwelcome, surfaced in her mind. A flicker of resentment for her own barrenness, a sharp, bitter pang of jealousy toward a neighbor who had just given birth to a healthy son. The thought was so swift and so private that she barely acknowledged it, but the feeling it left behind was one of shame and confusion. She quickly dismissed it, attributing her unease to the child's tragic circumstances and her own nervousness. She took Eliza's small, cold hand and led her inside, into the flickering warmth of the cabin, away from the oppressive gray of the Appalachian sky. The first few days established a strange and disquieting routine. Eliza remained utterly silent. She ate what was put before her without complaint. She sat by the fire when directed, and she slept in the small cot prepared for her. But she initiated nothing. She did not play with the wooden bird the mother had carved. She did not explore the corners of the cabin. She did not respond to questions or gentle prompts. Her existence was one of passive presence, a small, still center in the life of the family. The only active thing about her was her gaze. She would sit for what seemed like hours, her pale eyes fixed on the father as he mended a piece of leather tackle, or on the mother as she kneaded dough. They tried to grow accustomed to it, telling themselves it was a symptom of her trauma, but the feeling of being scrutinized, of being seen in a way they had never been seen before, never truly faded. The father, a man not given to flights of fancy, found his concentration slipping under that unwavering stare. As he worked the iron at his forge, he would sometimes feel her eyes on him from the cabin doorway, and a sudden, unwelcome memory would rise in his mind. The recollection of a dishonest trade he had made years ago, a small act of greed that he had long since pushed from his conscience. It came to him with a startling clarity, a fresh wave of guilt that made his hammer strike falter. He would shake his head, angry at himself for dwelling on such things, yet the feeling of being judged, of having an old sin exposed to the light, lingered like the bitter taste of soot in the air. The isolation of the cabin could not contain the strangeness of the child. It was inevitable that she would be introduced to the small, insular world of Harlan. The mother, determined to treat Eliza as a normal child, and perhaps hoping that social interaction might break her silence, decided to take her into the town's general store. The store was the hub of the community, a place of warmth and cluttered commerce, smelling of coffee grounds, cured tobacco, and damp wool. On that day, It was filled with several townsfolk seeking refuge from the cold and stocking up on supplies. As the mother entered with Eliza, the conversations quieted for a moment, as they always did when a new face appeared. The store owner, a portly man with a genial disposition, leaned on the counter and offered a kind word of welcome to the child. The mother explained her situation, that she was an orphan, that she was not yet accustomed to her new surroundings. Eliza stood beside her foster mother, her small form barely reaching the woman's waist, and her eyes began to move across the room. She looked at the faces of the people gathered there, her gaze lingering on each for a few seconds before moving to the next. It was then that the first observable public incidents occurred. A woman, the wife of the town's pastor, was in the middle of recounting a piece of local gossip. As Eliza's pale gray eyes met hers, the woman stopped mid-sentence. Her face, which had been animated and bright, suddenly went slack. A faint blush rose on her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands, fumbling with the strings of her purse. She stammered an apology and claimed she had forgotten what she was saying, her voice suddenly strained. A few feet away, a farmer who was known for his boisterous laughter and loud opinions was examining a new axe handle. When Eliza's gaze fell upon him, he flinched, a barely perceptible but definite physical reaction. He dropped the axe handle, which clattered loudly on the wooden floorboards. He stared at the child for a long moment, his expression a mixture of confusion and a kind of dawning horror. Without a word to anyone, he turned and walked briskly out of the store, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The store owner tried to dismiss the moment with a nervous chuckle, commenting on the bitter cold affecting everyone's moods. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The warmth had been replaced by a tense, uncomfortable quiet. People avoided looking at the child. They completed their purchases in hurried, hushed tones and left without their usual lingering conversations. The mother, holding Eliza's hand, felt a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She could feel the stares of the remaining townsfolk, no longer curious, but now tinged with something else, suspicion and a nascent fear. She saw not a collection of neighbors, but a tribunal of silent judges. The store owner, as he handed her the change, refused to meet her eyes, and more pointedly, he refused to look down at the silent child standing beside her. He simply pushed the coins across the counter and turned away to busy himself with arranging jars on a shelf. The walk back to the cabin was a lonely one. The snow had begun to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that muffled the world in a blanket of white. But the silence that now walked with them felt different. It was no longer just the absence of Eliza's voice. It was heavier now, freighted with the unease of others, a communal disquiet that had taken root in the heart of the town. The mother looked down at the small, pale girl whose hand she held. She was just a child, a victim of tragedy, and yet a terrifying question had begun to form in the deepest recesses of her mind, a question that she dared not give voice to. What had those people seen when this child looked at them? What secret, hidden part of themselves had been reflected back in those silent, gray eyes? The first whispers of fear had begun, not in the minds of those afflicted by her gaze, but in the spaces between them, in the shared glances and abrupt silences that now marked the presence of the mute girl of Harlan. The town's personal unease was beginning to coalesce, a prelude to a shared horror they could not yet name. The strange and abrupt exodus from the general store left an invisible stain on the fabric of the small community, a memory of shared discomfort that no one was yet willing to discuss. For the mother and father, the walk home was burdened by a new and terrible weight. They tried to rationalize what they had witnessed, attributing the townsfolk's bizarre behavior to the oppressive gloom of the long winter, a kind of collective cabin fever that could make people edgy and strange. The father spoke of the farmer's known penchant for drink, suggesting he was likely unwell. The mother theorized that the pastor's wife was a woman of delicate nerves, easily flustered. They constructed a fragile edifice of logic around the event, because the alternative, that the silent child walking between them was the direct cause, was too monstrous to contemplate. And yet, the question lingered in the cold air, unasked but deeply felt by both of them. What had happened in that store? They retreated into the perceived safety of their cabin, the silence within its walls now feeling less like peace and more like a held breath, a tense anticipation of something yet to come. They did not know that the phenomenon they were trying so desperately to dismiss was not an isolated incident, but the first tremor of a psychological earthquake that was about to shatter the foundations of their world. The epicenter of this burgeoning dread was the store owner. After the last of his customers had fled, he had moved about his store with a sense of profound unease, the familiar space of his livelihood suddenly feeling alien and hostile. He tidied shelves that were already tidy, and tallied accounts that were already balanced, his hands performing the tasks of routine, while his mind replayed the scene over and over. He had seen the look on the farmer's face, a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had witnessed the shame that had so suddenly consumed the pastor's wife. He had felt the chill descend upon the room, a palpable entity that had extinguished all warmth and fellowship. That night, long after he had barred the door and shuttered the windows, he sat by the dying embers of his pot-bellied stove, the day's meager earnings spread out on the counter before him. The only light came from a single oil lamp, which cast long, dancing shadows that made the stacked goods around him seem like silent, watchful figures. He was a man who prided himself on his steady nerve and his rational mind, a man who dealt in the tangible realities of salt and flour, nails and cloth. But the events of the day had unsettled him to his core. As he was about to extinguish the lamp, he heard a soft knock at the door. His initial reaction was one of irritation. A late-night caller in the dead of winter was a rarity and usually meant trouble. He opened the door a crack to see the blacksmith, the girl's foster father, standing on his porch, a dusting of fresh snow on his shoulders. The man apologized for the late hour, explaining that his wife had discovered she was out of salt, a vital commodity for curing the last of their pork. The store owner's heart sank. He could not refuse the request, yet the thought of interacting with that family again filled him with a nameless dread. He opened the door wider and saw the small, still form of Eliza standing behind her new father. She was a shadow in the doorway, her face pale in the faint moonlight. The father explained that he could not leave the child alone. The store owner simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and turned to fetch the salt. As he scooped the coarse crystals into a small cloth bag, he could feel the child's eyes on him. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the task, on the scraping sound of the scoop against the bottom of the barrel. But the gaze was a physical pressure, a weight against the back of his neck. He turned, the bag of salt in his hand, and his eyes met Eliza's. For a long, silent moment, the world seemed to stop. The flickering of the lamp, the moan of the wind outside, the crackle of the embers in the stove, all of it faded into an immense, internal silence. And then, the whispers began. They did not come from the child's lips. They did not enter through his ears. They bloomed in the center of his own mind, spoken in the familiar cadence of his own internal voice. He heard, with a terrifying clarity, a recitation of his own hidden guilts. He heard the thought he'd had just last week, a flicker of cruel satisfaction upon hearing that a rival merchant in the next county had suffered a fire. He heard the memory of his thumb, pressing ever so slightly on the scale, when weighing out expensive tobacco for a customer who was too trusting to notice. He heard a litany of small, greedy sins, of covetous glances, of lies of omission told to his own wife about their finances. These were not memories he summoned. They were thoughts forced upon him, presented with the cold, undeniable authority of a courtroom verdict. The shame was so potent, so overwhelming, that it felt like a physical blow. His breath hitched in his chest, his hand trembled, spilling a small stream of white salt onto the dusty floorboards. He thrust the bag toward the father, his eyes wide with a terror he could not conceal. He mumbled a price, a figure far lower than what he should have charged, his only desire in that moment being for them to leave, to take that silent, all-seeing child away from him, to release him from the excruciating intimacy of her gaze. He bolted the door behind them and leaned against it, his body slick with a cold sweat, the echoes of his own damning thoughts ringing in the sudden, profound silence of his empty store. The seed of paranoia, once planted, grew with alarming speed in the fertile soil of Harlan's isolation. The next public display of the girl's unnerving influence involved those least equipped to understand or conceal it, the town's children. Several days after the incident at the store, a small group of them were playing in a clearing at the edge of the woods. It was a cold but bright afternoon, the sun casting a weak, white light on the snow-covered ground. Their game was a simple one, a boisterous and breathless affair that filled the crisp air with shouts and laughter. Eliza and her foster mother were walking nearby, gathering fallen branches for kindling. The mother, still clinging to the hope of normalcy, had encouraged the girl to watch the other children, perhaps hoping the sight of their play might spark some response in her. Eliza stood at the edge of the clearing, a small, solitary figure partially concealed by the trunk of a great oak. For a time, the children paid her no mind, lost in the world of their game. Then, one of the older boys, the son of the farmer who had fled the general store, paused to catch his breath. He noticed the mute girl watching them, her pale eyes fixed on the group. He felt a flicker of the same unease he had heard his father muttering about late at night. He stared back at her, a silent challenge passing between them. As Eliza's gaze met his, the laughter died in his throat. His face went pale. He suddenly heard a voice in his head, a voice that was his own yet felt alien. It whispered a secret he thought no one else could possibly know, the memory of a week prior, when he had found a bird with a broken wing and, instead of helping it, he had thrown stones at it until it was still. The memory came with the full, sickening weight of the cruelty he had felt in that moment, a secret shame he had buried deep within himself. He let out a choked cry and stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror. Another child, a young girl, turned to see what was wrong, and her eyes, too, fell upon Eliza. The girl's cheerful expression dissolved into one of confusion, then terror. She began to cry, turning to run back toward the town. She told her friends that she heard a voice telling her she was bad, that it was reminding her of the lie she had told her mother that very morning. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. The children's game ended in a flurry of terrified screams. They fled from the clearing as if pursued by a demon, their joyous shouts replaced by cries of fear. They ran back to their homes, babbling to their parents about the mute girl, claiming she had put bad thoughts in their heads, that she could hear their secrets. The whispers were no longer just a metaphor. They were now a literal complaint, a terrifying reality for the children of Harlan. These strange and frightening accounts inevitably found their way to the town's sole medical authority, a man we will refer to as the doctor. The doctor was a man of logic and learning, a graduate of a respectable Philadelphia medical college. His small office, attached to his home, was a bastion of scientific reason in a community often ruled by faith and superstition. It smelled of carbolic acid and old paper, its shelves lined with thick medical textbooks and jars of tinctures. He was, by nature and training, a skeptic. When the first parents arrived with their frightened, weeping children, he listened patiently, his expression professionally neutral. He examined the children, found no signs of fever or physical ailment, and initially diagnosed the phenomenon as a case of shared delusion, a sort of infectious fantasy, sparked by the arrival of a strange newcomer and amplified by the anxieties of a long, hard winter. He recorded in his journal that the town was succumbing to a mild form of mass hysteria, a known psychological condition. He prescribed calming herbal teas for the children and offered reassuring words to their parents. His confidence in this diagnosis began to waver when the store owner came to see him. The man was a shadow of his former self. His face was sallow, his hands trembled, and he spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper. He described his encounter with Eliza in excruciating detail. He insisted he was not a superstitious man, but he could not explain what had happened. He told the doctor that it was not like hearing a voice from outside, but like having his own conscience turned against him, as if the girl's eyes were a key that unlocked a room in his mind where he kept his darkest secrets, and then forced him to look inside. The doctor listened, taking meticulous notes. He recorded the patient's symptoms: insomnia, heart palpitations, acute paranoia. He considered a diagnosis of a nervous breakdown brought on by the stresses of a failing business in a hard winter. But he could not ignore the striking similarity between the store owner's account and the fragmented, terrified descriptions offered by the children. The trigger was always the same: the direct, silent gaze of Eliza Whitcomb. Over the next 2 weeks, the doctor's office saw a slow but steady trickle of Harlan's residents. The pastor's wife came to him, complaining of debilitating headaches and a sense of profound, unshakable guilt that had descended upon her after her brief encounter with the child at the store. The farmer came, his usual boisterousness replaced by a sullen, fearful silence. He would not specify what he had heard, but he told the doctor that the girl had looked at him and he had seen his own soul, and it was black. The doctor's journal from this period chronicles his growing bewilderment. He was a man of science, trained to look for patterns, and a terrifying pattern was indeed emerging. Each patient described the same phenomenon: an intrusive, auditory hallucination of their own thoughts, specifically thoughts of a secretive, shameful, or guilt-ridden nature, occurring immediately upon making eye contact with the orphan girl. He wrote that it was as if the child was a catalyst, a passive agent that did not create the thoughts, but somehow accessed and amplified what was already present in the minds of her observers. This raised a dreadful and illogical question that the doctor could not answer with his medical texts. Was this a projection of the town's collective guilty conscience, or was the girl herself a conduit for some unknown, unknowable power? His scientific skepticism was being eroded, replaced by a cold intellectual dread. He had become the reluctant archivist of a phenomenon that defied all rational explanation. The town, however, was not waiting for a scientific verdict. The whispers in the mind had become hushed conversations in the tavern and fearful glances on the street. The dread was no longer a private, internal experience. It was becoming a shared belief, a communal fear of contamination. The people of Harlan were beginning to look at the small, silent child not as a tragic orphan, but as a terrible omen, a vessel of judgment that had been sent to live among them. The doctor's clinical observations, recorded in a steady, scientific hand, were a private and rational attempt to contain an irrational outbreak. But his journal was a lonely island of logic in a rising tide of communal terror. In the town of Harlan, fear had escaped the confines of individual minds and was now a contagion, spreading from house to house in hushed conversations, in the fearful glances exchanged over splintered fences, and in the sudden, prayerful silences that fell whenever the small, mute girl was seen passing by. The disquiet was no longer a personal affliction. It had become a public crisis, a spiritual sickness that the town felt compelled to diagnose and excise. And in a community like Harlan, where life's great mysteries and hardships were interpreted through the stark lens of Scripture, there was only one place to seek such a diagnosis: the cold, timber-framed church that stood on a small rise overlooking the town. The pastor of Harlan was a man caught between the rigid doctrines of his faith and the raw, primal fear of his congregation. He was a stern man, whose sermons usually focused on the practical virtues of hard work and piety, on the clear and unambiguous divide between sin and salvation. The stories that now reached him about the orphan girl, however, belonged to a different, darker chapter of his theology. They were tales that echoed the biblical warnings of possession, of false prophets, and of living vessels for unseen forces. In the days following the mass flight of the children from the woods, his study became a confessional, not for sins committed, but for terrors experienced. He listened to the store owner's trembling account of his own revealed greed. He heard from the farmer, who spoke of a deep, unnameable wickedness the child's eyes had shown him in his own heart. He comforted his own wife, who was now plagued by nightmares and a constant, humming anxiety. He prayed for guidance, his Bible open on his desk, its pages speaking of trials and tribulations sent to test the faith of believers. But the fear he saw in the eyes of his flock was not the fear of a divine test. It was the fear of something unclean, something that had come to dwell among them. The pressure from the community was immense. They looked to him not just for comfort, but for an explanation, for a name to put to the horror that had taken root in their town. The following Sunday, the church was more crowded than it had been since the last spring revival. There was no warmth in the gathering, only a shared, anxious chill that the single iron stove could not dispel. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and fear. Every eye was on the pastor as he ascended the pulpit. He was a man visibly burdened, his face etched with the sleeplessness of a spiritual shepherd facing a wolf he could not comprehend. His sermon that morning was not about forgiveness or redemption. It was about discernment. It was about the presence of evil in the world, an active and insidious force that could wear the most innocent of masks. He did not speak Eliza Whitcomb's name. He did not have to. Every person in that church knew of whom he spoke. He told them that the scriptures warned that in times of weakness, dark influences could take hold. He spoke of a vessel, empty of its own voice, which could therefore be filled by another. He posed a question that hung in the cold air like a death sentence. He asked if a thing that reveals sin without speaking the word of God could possibly be a holy instrument. He suggested that it was the work of a deceiver, an entity that offers knowledge not for salvation, but for the purpose of breeding despair and turning neighbor against neighbor. He declared that God tested his people, but that the devil tempted them by showing them the ugliest truths of their own hearts, not to cleanse them, but to make them drown in their own shame. With every carefully chosen word, he was transforming the mute orphan from a psychological curiosity into a theological threat. He was giving their fear a name, a shape, and a scriptural context. He was recasting Eliza as a mirror for sin, a demonic looking glass brought to their town to show them their own damnation. The effect of the sermon was immediate and profound. It validated the town's terror, giving it the unassailable authority of divine interpretation. The fear, now sanctified, turned outward. The shared experience of the whispers was no longer a source of communal dread, but a catalyst for mutual suspicion. If the girl was a mirror, then the ugly reflections people saw had to be real. The hidden sins she exposed were not just personal failings, they were now public knowledge, or at least public suspicion. The social fabric of Harlan, woven from generations of interdependence and trust, began to unravel with terrifying speed. The first tear appeared just outside the church doors after the service. A man, a trapper whose face was a mask of gaunt fury, confronted his neighbor. He did not shout. He spoke in a low, trembling voice that carried further than any yell. He said that when the girl had looked at him the day before, he had heard his own thoughts of envy for his neighbor's plot of land, a dark and covetousness he had never admitted even to himself. The neighbor, a quiet farmer, blanched, his denial weak and stammering. It did not matter that the thought had belonged to the accuser. The accusation itself was the poison. People who overheard the exchange looked at the farmer differently, their eyes now filled with a new, cold calculation. Had he cheated the trapper in a past trade? Was his good fortune ill-gotten? The girl's gaze had not spoken a word, but it had leveled a charge of sin that was impossible to refute. This incident was the first of many. A woman at the town well turned her back on her cousin, later telling her husband that when the mute child had passed, she had been forced to hear her own long-buried resentment over a disputed inheritance. The cousin, sensing the coldness but not knowing its specific cause, was left in a state of confused misery. Families that had known each other for decades began to avoid one another. A profound and chilling paranoia settled over the town. Every social interaction was now fraught with a terrible uncertainty. What did they know? What had the child's eyes shown them? The whispers in the mind had created a world where everyone was potentially a judge, and everyone was potentially guilty. Harlan was ceasing to be a community. It was becoming a collection of isolated, suspicious souls, each trapped in the prison of their own perceived guilt, a guilt they now feared was visible to all. For the Foster family, this social collapse was not an abstract terror, but a daily, grinding reality. The ostracism was absolute and suffocating. The father, the blacksmith, found his livelihood had vanished overnight. Men would walk their horses miles further to the next settlement rather than enter his forge. They would not meet his eyes as they passed, their faces grim and set. The forge, once a place of fire, noise, and gruff camaraderie, now stood cold and silent, a monument to his new status as a pariah. The mother endured her own quiet calvary. Her trips for supplies became exercises in humiliation. The store owner would serve her in stony silence, his hands shaking as he took her coins. Women who had been her friends for years would now cross the muddy street to avoid her path, pulling their own children close as if she, too, were contaminated. The isolation they felt was no longer just a feature of the geography. It was a wall built by their neighbors, brick by silent brick. Their cabin, once a place of hopeful beginnings, became their prison. The silence within its walls was now a different entity entirely. It was the silence of the world outside, the silence of a community that had excised them from its heart. And at the center of that silence sat Eliza, a small, still figure, seemingly oblivious to the storm that raged around her. The mother's heart was a battleground of warring emotions. A fierce, primal instinct to protect the helpless child in her care fought against the insidious whispers of doubt planted by the town. She would look at Eliza, searching for any sign of malice, any flicker of the demonic presence the pastor had described. She saw only a frail, lost child. But then she would remember the farmer's terrified face, the pastor's wife's nervous breakdown, the fear in her own husband's eyes. She would recall the ugly thoughts that had surfaced in her own mind upon the girl's arrival. Was she a fool, harboring a viper in her own home? Was her maternal longing blinding her to a terrible truth? The love she had been so ready to give was curdling into a complex mixture of pity and a dreadful, creeping fear. The family was alone, adrift in a sea of condemnation. The town's fear had moved beyond passive avoidance. The whispers in the church and the accusations on the street were hardening into a collective resolve. It was no longer enough to shun the source of their torment. A consensus was forming in the shadowy corners of Harlan, a belief that the mirror of their sins had to be confronted directly. The transition from social rejection to violent suspicion was nearly complete. The town was preparing to take action, to force a reckoning with the silent girl who had, by her mere presence, brought them to the brink of madness. The silent judgment that had fallen upon the Foster family was merely a prelude, a period of quiet containment before the town's fear demanded a more active and visible confrontation. The pastor's sermon had provided the theological framework for their terror, transforming the mute girl from a strange child into a potential vessel of demonic influence. This was no longer a matter of social discomfort or psychological disturbance. It had been elevated to a spiritual crisis, a battle for the very soul of Harlan. In the days that followed, a grim consensus formed, not in a public meeting, but in the furtive conversations held in the tavern, in the shared, knowing glances between men at the gristmill, and in the anxious prayers of women in their kitchens. They felt they could no longer simply avoid the child. They believed they had to confront the entity they imagined was residing within her. They resolved to bring her to the house of God, to the one place where they believed the powers of darkness could be challenged and expelled. They would put her silence on trial. The decision was delivered not with a formal summons, but with the arrival of a small deputation of men at the blacksmith's cabin. They came at dusk, when the world was turning to shades of gray and blue, their dark figures materializing from the twilight like specters. The pastor led them, his face a rigid mask of solemn duty. With him were the farmer whose son had fled the woods, the trapper who had publicly accused his neighbor, and two other grim-faced elders of the church. They did not knock. They simply appeared at the door, their presence an undeniable and menacing command. The father opened the door and stood before them, his large frame filling the doorway, a silent and defiant sentinel. But he was one man against the collected will of the town. The pastor spoke, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. He said that the child, Eliza, was required at the church. He stated it was for the good of her own soul, and for the spiritual well-being of the community. He framed it as an act of concern, a necessary spiritual examination, but the tone of his voice, and the hard, unforgiving eyes of the men behind him told a different story. This was not an invitation, it was an edict. The mother stood behind her husband, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. A wave of pure, animal terror washed over her. She looked at Eliza, who was sitting on her small cot, watching the scene with her usual unnerving stillness, her pale eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. For a moment, the mother considered refusing, screaming, barricading the door, but she saw the futility of it. She saw the iron certainty on the men's faces. To resist would only invite violence to their doorstep. With a sense of crushing inevitability, she wrapped a thin shawl around Eliza's shoulders. The father stepped aside from the door, his posture one of defeat. As the mother led the small girl outside, into the circle of grim-faced men, she felt as if she were leading a lamb to an altar. The walk to the church was a slow, agonizing procession. It seemed the entire population of Harlan had emerged from their homes to bear witness. They did not shout or jeer. They stood in silent, watchful clusters, their faces pale and indistinct in the gathering dark. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on the frozen mud of the road and the mournful sigh of the wind through the bare branches of the trees. The weight of their collective gaze was a physical force, a suffocating blanket of condemnation that pressed down on the small party. Eliza walked without resistance, her small hand in the mother's, her head held not in fear or defiance, but in that same neutral, observant calm that so unsettled everyone. She seemed to be the only creature in Harlan not consumed by the fevered emotion of the night. The church was a scene of controlled chaos. It was packed far beyond its intended capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crammed against the back walls. The air was hot and thick, heavy with the smell of damp wool, sweat, and the collective, animal scent of human fear. The only illumination came from dozens of tallow candles, their flickering, unstable light casting a jaundiced glow on the sea of upturned faces and making the shadows in the rafters writhe like living things. The atmosphere was not one of pious contemplation, but of a tense, almost breathless anticipation, like the moments before a public execution. Eliza was led to the front and made to sit on a simple, three-legged stool placed directly before the pulpit. She was a tiny, isolated figure in a vast ocean of hostile humanity. The mother and father were directed to the front pew, where they sat like prisoners at the trial of their own child, helpless to intervene. The pastor mounted the pulpit, looming over the small girl. He raised his hands, calling for a silence that had already fallen. He began to speak, his voice ringing with a strained, theatrical authority. He addressed the congregation first, reminding them of their duty to be vigilant against the works of darkness. Then he turned his attention to the child. He did not use her name. He addressed her as the vessel. He demanded to know what spirit animated her silent form. He commanded her, in the name of God, to speak and give an account of the affliction she had brought upon their town. He posed a series of rhetorical questions, his voice rising with each one, painting her as a source of discord, a catalyst for sin, a silent accuser who turned neighbor against neighbor. Eliza, in response, did nothing. She simply sat on the stool, her hands folded in her lap, and looked up at the man who was condemning her. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and utterly silent. The pastor, receiving no answer, turned to the congregation. He declared that if the vessel would not speak, then those who had been afflicted by it must give testimony. He called the first accuser, the farmer. The large man pushed his way through the crowd and stood before the child. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He began to speak, his voice a hoarse, angry tremor. He pointed a trembling finger at Eliza and accused her of putting wicked thoughts into the heads of his children, of making them fear her presence. He said she was unnatural, a curse upon the land. As he spoke, his eyes remained locked on Eliza's. And then, a change came over him. His tirade began to falter. He stammered, his words catching in his throat. His gaze became unfocused, as if he were listening to something far away. The whispers had begun. In the cavern of his own mind, he heard not just the secrets he had shared with the doctor, but a deeper, more shameful litany. He heard his own secret contempt for his wife's piety. He heard his own brutal and uncharitable thoughts about a neighbor who had fallen on hard times. He heard a voice, his own voice, whispering a blasphemy he had once thought in a moment of drunken despair. He clapped his hands over his ears as if to block out a physical sound. "Stop it," he mumbled, the word barely audible. The congregation leaned forward, straining to hear. The farmer was no longer addressing the child. He was arguing with himself. He began to speak aloud, not in coherent sentences, but in fragmented, desperate phrases. He spoke of a lazy afternoon spent sleeping instead of mending a fence. He spoke of watering down his cider before selling it. He spoke of a cruel prayer he had once made for a rival's crop to fail. He was not confessing. He was trying to refute the voice in his own head, and in doing so, He was broadcasting his hidden sins to the entire horrified town. He finally collapsed to his knees, a great, shuddering sob escaping his throat, his face buried in his hands, a man utterly broken by the weight of his own revealed conscience. A wave of shock and fascinated horror washed through the church. Before the pastor could regain control, a second accuser pushed forward. It was his own wife. Her face was a pale, tight mask of hysteria. She came to defend her husband's sermon, to denounce the child who had filled her with such anxiety. She stood over Eliza, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. She began to speak of the unnatural fear the girl inspired, of the sense of guilt that clung to her like a shroud. And as she met the child's calm, gray eyes, her voice, too, began to change. Her accusations turned inward. She began to speak of her own sins of pride, of the silent judgment she passed on the other women of the congregation for their clothes, for their children, for their cooking. She spoke of her secret vanity, of the pleasure she took in the perceived righteousness of her own household. Her voice rose to a shrill, weeping crescendo as she confessed her jealousy of the blacksmith's wife for being given a child, even a cursed one, while her own prayers for another had gone unanswered. Her public piety was stripped away, revealing the raw, petty resentments that lay beneath. She dissolved into helpless, hysterical sobs, stumbling back into the crowd, her reputation and her composure shattered in the same instant. The spectacle of these two public breakdowns did not deter a third accuser, the trapper. He strode forward, his face contorted with a violent rage. He was not there to confess weakness. He was there to demand retribution. He bellowed that the child was a witch, that she had made him see the darkness in his own heart. As he stared down at her, his face inches from hers, a strange, feral grin spread across his lips. The whispers that came to him were not of greed or pride, but of his own capacity for violence. He began to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the stunned silence of the church. He started describing, in vivid and disturbing detail, the cruelty he inflicted on the animals caught in his traps. He spoke of a dog he had once kicked to death for stealing a piece of bait. He spoke of a deep, secret pleasure he took in the act of killing, a bloodlust that went far beyond the necessities of his trade. His testimony was not an unraveling. It was a gleeful, terrifying embrace of his own darkness. He was not breaking down. He was being laid bare. It was at this moment that the fragile container of the trial shattered completely. The chaos spread from the front of the church like a fire racing through dry grass. People in the pews, their eyes fixed on the small, silent girl, began to succumb to the same phenomenon. A woman in the third row began to cry out, accusing the man next to her of coveting her, only for him to shout back a confession of his own adulterous thoughts. A man near the back stood up and began a rambling, incoherent monologue about a theft he had committed years ago. Sobs, shouts, and muttered confessions erupted throughout the church. The air became a thick, unbreathable soup of shared hysteria and released guilt. The pastor, his face ashen, stood frozen in the pulpit, a captain watching his ship tear itself apart on the rocks. He raised his Bible, shouting passages about repentance and order, but his voice was a tiny, irrelevant sound in the maelstrom. In a moment of fatal curiosity, his own eyes were drawn back to the still figure of Eliza. For a fleeting instant, a thought of profound, unshakable doubt entered his mind, a whisper that suggested his own actions that night were born not of faith, but of a prideful desire to control the fear of his flock. The thought struck him with such force that his voice died in his throat. His certainty vanished, replaced by a cold, hollowing terror. The trial had failed. The attempt to cast out a demon had instead unleashed 100 more, one for every soul packed into the suffocating, candle-lit horror of the church. The town of Harlan was not destroying a curse, it was destroying itself, and the silent girl on the stool was merely the mirror in which they were forced to watch it happen. The failed exorcism had left them broken, terrified, and convinced that their only remaining option was a final, desperate act of annihilation. The catastrophic spectacle inside the church did not cleanse the town of its fear. It baptized it in a new and far more volatile element: shame. The raw, public exposure of so many private sins had shattered the last vestiges of social order. The trial had been a desperate attempt to impose a familiar theological narrative on an inexplicable horror, but it had backfired with apocalyptic consequences. Instead of uniting the congregation against a common enemy, it had revealed the enemy to be within each of them. The whispers they had once heard in the privacy of their own minds had been given voice in the house of God, turning the sacred space into a theater of mass humiliation. As the townsfolk stumbled out of the church, they did not look at one another. They could not. The knowledge of what had been revealed, the shared intimacy of their collective guilt, was an impassable chasm between them. The night air, cold and sharp, did nothing to clear the fever from their minds. A new, terrible consensus was taking shape, a conclusion born not of reason or faith, but of a primal, desperate need to silence the voices that now echoed in the ruins of their community. If the mirror could not be controlled, it had to be shattered. The chaos that had erupted in the church did not dissipate. It coalesced into a single, malevolent purpose. The farmer, his face streaked with tears and dirt, was no longer weeping in shame, but filled with a self-loathing that had curdled into a murderous rage. The trapper, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of his own unleashed cruelty, was a willing instrument of the violence to come. The pastor, his spiritual authority in tatters, was swept along by the current, his earlier doubts consumed by the overwhelming need to bring this horror to a definitive end, no matter the cost. A man, his face a grim silhouette against the candlelit windows of the church, shouted the words that everyone was thinking, that the evil could not be allowed to live another day, that it had to be burned out, purged from their land like a plague. The suggestion, spoken into the tense, agitated silence, acted as a spark on dry tinder. The mob did not form with a debate or a vote. It was a spontaneous, horrific crystallization of their shared terror and shame. Men ran to their homes, not to seek refuge, but to retrieve weapons and fuel for a fire. They emerged moments later with axes, pitchforks, and hunting rifles. Others brought lanterns and torches, their flames small, angry stars in the oppressive darkness. The mob moved as a single organism, a shambling, many-limbed beast driven by a singular, reptilian instinct to destroy the source of its pain. At the center of this storm, the foster parents were caught in a nightmare from which there was no waking. During the pandemonium of the trial's collapse, the father, his face a mask of grim determination, had seized the opportunity. He had pushed his way through the hysterical crowd, grabbed Eliza from the stool, and, with the mother clinging to his arm, had fled the church. They did not stop to reason or to pack. They simply ran, plunging into the darkness of the woods that surrounded their small cabin, the terrible sounds of the town's collective breakdown echoing behind them. They huddled in the freezing cold, concealed behind a rocky outcrop, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The mother held Eliza tightly, shielding the small, silent girl with her own body. The child did not tremble. She did not cry. She was a point of absolute, unnerving stillness in the heart of the chaos. The father peered through the bare branches of the trees, his eyes fixed on the distant, flickering lights of the town. He watched as the scattered points of light began to converge, to form a single, menacing river of fire that started to flow in their direction. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were not just being pursued, they were being hunted. The mob arrived at the small cabin, not as a collection of neighbors, but as an elemental force of destruction. The torchlight threw their faces into grotesque relief, a gallery of mouths twisted in rage and eyes wide with a mixture of terror and righteous fury. They surrounded the small dark structure, their numbers a crushing, overwhelming presence against the vast indifferent wilderness. The pastor stood at the forefront, his Bible held aloft like a weapon, his voice hoarse as he declared the ground unholy. He called the cabin a den of iniquity, a home that had harbored a corrupting influence. His words were the final, terrible absolution the mob needed, a holy sanction for the violence they were about to unleash. They did not call for the family to come out. They did not offer terms of surrender. Their judgment had already been passed. The first torch was thrown, a high, graceful arc of fire that landed on the dry tinder of the cabin's thatched roof. Within seconds, a small tongue of flame had grown into a hungry, roaring beast, consuming the dry wood with a terrifying speed. More torches followed, and soon the entire cabin was engulfed, a raging funeral pyre against the black Appalachian sky. The fire cast a hellish, orange glow, illuminating the faces of the mob with a demonic light, their shadows dancing like enormous, distorted figures on the surrounding trees. From their hiding place in the woods, the father and mother could only watch in horrified silence as their home, the repository of their simple life and their fragile hopes, was consumed by the flames. The father held his wife, trying to stifle her sobs, his own body trembling with a potent cocktail of grief and helpless rage. He was a blacksmith, a man whose life was defined by the act of building and shaping, and he was being forced to watch his world be unmade. But the mob was not satisfied with the destruction of the building. Their bloodlust, now fully aroused, demanded a human sacrifice. They began to search the surrounding area, their torches cutting through the darkness, their voices a low, menacing chorus as they called out for the family, for the witch. The father knew that staying hidden was no longer an option. They would be found, and when they were, there would be no mercy. His mind raced, searching for an escape, for some path through the darkness that would lead them away from this madness. He decided their only chance was to create a diversion, to draw the mob away from his wife and the child. He made a decision born of absolute love and utter desperation. He told his wife to run, to take Eliza and flee deeper into the woods, to follow the creek bed until she was miles away. He told her not to stop, no matter what she heard. He kissed her one last time, a frantic, desperate act in the flickering, hellish light. Then, he stood up from their hiding place and let out a great, defiant roar, a challenge to the monsters who had been his neighbors. He charged out of the woods, not toward the burning cabin, but in the opposite direction, drawing the eye of the mob, pulling their rage toward him. For a moment, it worked. The hunters turned their attention to this new prey, their shouts changing in tone from a searching call to a triumphant, predatory cry. They gave chase, a wave of fire and steel crashing through the underbrush after the lone, fleeing figure. The mother, her mind numb with shock and grief, did as she was told. She took Eliza's hand and scrambled down the embankment to the frozen creek, her feet slipping on the icy stones. But she could not obey her husband's last command. She could not stop herself from looking back, and what she saw would be seared into her memory for the rest of her days. She saw the mob catch her husband. She saw the farmer, the man whose children she had known since birth, bring the butt of his rifle down on the blacksmith's head. She saw the trapper, his face a mask of ecstatic cruelty, use his pitchfork not as a tool, but as a weapon. She saw the pastor standing by, his face turned away, his Bible clutched to his chest, a silent, passive accomplice to a murder. Her scream was a raw, voiceless thing, a tear in the fabric of the night that was swallowed by the roar of the fire and the triumphant shouts of the mob. As her husband fell, a new and terrible sound began to fill the air. It was not the sound of the fire or the mob, it was the sound of whispers. But these were not the silent, internal whispers of before. As the flames from the cabin leaped higher, as the violence reached its terrible crescendo, the darkest thoughts of the townsfolk seemed to be drawn out of them, amplified and broadcast into the night air for all to hear. The mother, crouched by the creek, could hear them. She heard the farmer's silent, screaming terror of his own damnation. She heard the trapper's gleeful, internal litany of his own violent acts. She heard the pastor's wife's bitter, resentful prayers. It was as if the girl's silent power, supercharged by the intense, violent emotions of the mob, had broken its usual confines. The townsfolk heard it too. They heard not only their own thoughts, but the thoughts of the men and women standing beside them. The trapper heard the farmer's secret fear. The farmer heard the pastor's secret doubts. In the midst of their murderous frenzy, they were subjected to a moment of total, terrifying psychic intimacy. Their rage faltered, replaced by a new, more profound horror. They were no longer a unified mob. They were a collection of terrified, guilty individuals, trapped in a deafening, invisible storm of their own collective sin. The night of fire was not the purging they had hoped for. It was their damnation made audible. And in the chaos, as the mother finally turned to flee into the absolute darkness of the forest with the silent child in her hand, she had one last, terrifying realization. In the cacophony of amplified guilt and fear, there was only one mind that remained utterly, terrifyingly silent. Eliza's. The inferno that consumed the blacksmith's cabin and the life of its owner eventually burned itself out, leaving a blackened, smoldering scar on the landscape. The orange glow that had painted the night sky faded to a dull, gray dawn. The sun rose on a town that was not cleansed, but broken. The members of the mob who had acted with such unified, murderous certainty the night before now drifted back to their homes as individuals, their faces pale and gaunt in the morning light, their eyes hollowed out by what they had done and what they had heard. The orgy of violence had not brought catharsis. The amplified whispers they had experienced at the height of the frenzy had receded, but they had not vanished entirely. They had left behind a lingering, psychic residue, a faint but persistent echo that clung to the town like the smell of smoke. The silence that fell over Harlan was no longer the quiet of a peaceful, isolated community. It was the profound, suffocating silence of a shared and unforgivable crime. In the days and weeks that followed, the town of Harlan became a ghost of its former self. The rhythms of daily life, once so steady and predictable, were now fractured and uncertain. People moved through their chores with a listless, mechanical quality, their actions devoid of purpose or life. They continued to avoid one another, but the avoidance was no longer born of suspicion. It was born of a deep and abiding shame. To look a neighbor in the eye was to be reminded of the terrible intimacy of that night, to remember the ugly, naked thoughts you had heard whispered in the air, and to know that your own had been heard in turn. The communal bonds of trust and fellowship had been irrevocably severed, replaced by a permanent state of mutual disgrace. The tavern fell silent. The general store saw only the most necessary and hurried of transactions, and the church, the very place that had sanctioned the horror, stood empty. The pastor, a man shattered by his own complicity and the public failure of his faith, no longer called his flock to worship. There was no sermon he could deliver that could wash away the stain of that night. The survivors of the ordeal were marked in ways both visible and invisible. The farmer who had struck the first blow against the blacksmith became a recluse, his land slowly falling into neglect, his nights filled with a terror that sleep could not vanquish. The trapper, who had reveled in the violence, was found weeks later in the deep woods, having taken his own life. The pastor's wife descended into a state of permanent, agitated melancholy, a prisoner in her own home. But the most profound and lasting effect was the echo. The townsfolk who had been part of the mob reported hearing things in moments of quiet. It was no longer the clear, specific recitation of their sins, but a faint, maddening whisper at the very edge of their hearing, a psychic tinnitus that served as a constant reminder of their guilt. A man mending a fence would hear a faint, accusatory murmur in the sigh of the wind. A woman churning butter would hear a sibilant, mocking whisper in the rhythmic slosh of the cream. The silence of the Appalachian hills, once a source of solace and peace, was now filled with these phantom sounds, the lingering resonance of a horror that refused to die. The town's doctor became the unwilling chronicler of this slow, communal decay. His scientific skepticism had been burned away by the events he had witnessed, leaving behind a cold, observational dread. His journal from this period is not the record of a medical professional, but of an archivist of a town's damnation. He documented the psychological collapse of his neighbors with a detached, clinical precision. He noted the suicides, the descents into madness, the families that simply packed their meager belongings and left in the middle of the night, unable to bear the weight of the silence and the echoes. He also recorded the official story that was eventually cobbled together, a weak and transparent fabrication for the benefit of the county magistrate who came to investigate the fire. The townsfolk claimed that the blacksmith, in a fit of madness, had set his own house ablaze and had attacked those who came to help, forcing them to defend themselves. The story was a lie, but it was a lie that everyone tacitly agreed to uphold, a final, desperate act of collective denial. It is in the doctor's final, private entry on the matter that we find the most chilling detail. 2 days after the fire, driven by a sense of professional duty and a morbid curiosity he could not suppress, he had gone to the ruins of the cabin himself. He had sifted through the charred timbers and the cold gray ash, ostensibly searching for the remains of the blacksmith's wife and the child, Eliza Whitcomb. The body of the blacksmith had been recovered from the woods and buried in an unmarked grave, but of the other two, there was no sign. The official assumption was that they had perished in the fire, their bodies consumed so completely by the intense heat that nothing remained. But the doctor, in the last line he would ever write about the incident, noted a single, terrifying anomaly. He wrote that despite a meticulous 2-day search of the entire site, sifting through every inch of the ash and debris, he had found absolutely nothing. No fragments of bone, no scraps of cloth, no physical evidence whatsoever to suggest that the mother or the child had been in the cabin when it burned. It was as if they had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The body of Eliza Whitcomb was never recovered. This final, unresolved mystery was the seed from which a new and enduring legend grew. The town of Harlan did not recover. The echoes of guilt, combined with the hard realities of a failed community, were a death sentence. Over the next few years, the town slowly emptied out. Family by family, the residents abandoned their homes, leaving them to the wind and the encroaching wilderness. They sought escape from the haunted silence, from the whispers that followed them in their waking hours and tormented them in their dreams. The fields grew wild, the cabins sagged and collapsed, and the single muddy street was reclaimed by grass and weeds. Harlan became a ghost town, a silent monument to a community that had devoured itself. The question of what happened to Eliza Whitcomb was never answered. Some believed she had died in the woods, a lost child succumbing to the cold. Others, in hushed and fearful tones, whispered a different theory. They claimed she had never been a child at all, but something else, a spirit or an entity that had been drawn to the town's hidden sins and had departed once its terrible work was done. They believed that she had not perished, but had simply moved on, a silent, walking mirror, destined to reflect the darkness she found in other isolated, fearful places. The story of the Appalachian mute girl became a cautionary tale, a piece of dark folklore told around campfires in the surrounding counties. It served as a warning that the past is never truly dead, and that some silences are not empty, but are filled with the echoes of all the things we try to forget. The horror was not that the girl had been destroyed, but that she might have been eternal, leaving behind a permanent, haunting question that the town, in its final, agonizing moments, could never answer. Did she perish in the fire, or did she simply walk away, leaving them alone with the whispers she had unleashed, whispers that would echo in the empty hills of Harlan forever? The case file on Eliza Whitcomb is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.